So essentially, what you're saying is not all digital public goods are created equal. Talk about the vetting process for making something a digital public good, and how do you identify one that is a digital public good?
Yeah, no, so there is a 9-indicator standard for digital public goods. It is easily accessible on the website of the Digital Public Goods Alliance. And this comes out again of this evolution. And I would say that the whole term digital public goods and the alliance itself stems from the high-level panel on digital cooperation. So this was something established by the UN Secretary General with the aim of enhancing international digital cooperation. That's the background. So this standard exists, and there is a nomination process to submit a particular digital solution for verification against this standard. And if the standard then is met, the solution becomes available on the Digital Public Goods Registry, which is also hosted on the Digital Public Goods Alliance website, and where there are currently more than 150 verified digital public goods. And these get reassessed annually to ensure they are actually actively maintained, which is also very important.
I think that's very interesting. You talked about maintaining. Can you talk about who is creating, maintaining, and from my perspective, financial, who's paying for these resources?
Yeah, no, I think you'll find many different models, but I will start by saying that, yes, sustainability is often an issue. And there are many ways at looking at enhancing it. And one of them is, of course, to make sure that you build an active contributor community around your open solution. But still, even with the solutions that have the most active communities, there is very often a need for some kind of core funding. And the question is, how does that funding, who funds that? I think you have examples that are, for instance, where you have big international development donor components, both from government donors and from philanthropic funders. That is particularly where you have solutions where there is a really strong argument for a potential development impact in multiple contexts. Examples of these would be DHIS2 in health. It is an acronym, but that's the actual name of the solution. It stands for District Health Information System 2. That is a very widely scaled digital public good in health. Another example is MOSIP, a digital identity platform, where there are large core funders. I would also say a trend that I find very, very intriguing right now is the tendency for governments to open source their own systems. One example there could be Estonia's X-Road, for instance, which is actually not only Estonia, it's Estonia, Finland, and Iceland that is together with public funding maintaining the core technology, which is widely adopted in many, many countries. But there are also more commercial models where there are services provided on top to generate revenue to maintain the core. But it is tricky, particularly if your aim is to maximize social impact. I keep on arguing strongly that this is also something that we need to rally funders around. And, you know, I have many opinions of why that is important and why that is a good call to action also.
I'm glad you mentioned funders. And what I heard you say, there's a lot of funders that are interested in this. How do you make the case to funders and others for maintenance? How do you kind of avoid the tragedy of a commons when maintaining these public assets? How do you keep people invested in these digital public goods, Liv?
Yeah, no, I mean, one thing is to maintain the engagement and contributions back from whoever is adopting and adapting the technology. So that can be, you know, implementing organizations, countries, whatever that adoption case is, and to actually try to ensure that they contribute back to the core. But that is not funding necessarily, but more in terms of code contributions and helping ensure the relevance and the strength of the core product. But I do think the case for funders, and I will admit to, given that I have come from an international development assistance provider, NORAD, the organization I'm seconded to the alliance by, the argument that is being made, for instance, internally in NORAD is that this is really good impact for the money. It's good value for the money. And particularly if it's international official development assistance financing that's going into this space, public money should maximize the public interest. So that I think is a relatively easy case that it maximizes impact because you can reduce fragmentation and duplication and not invest in the same thing many times over again. I also think there are strong arguments also for the private sector to contribute. Very often there are, local vendor ecosystem opportunities around a product, meaning that, contributing to the technology also build your own expertise and your opportunity to provide services. So there can be many models. But I do think that you will need to make the argument differently than what you do for proprietary technologies, because the whole scalability model and impact argument is different.
That's right. I agree with that. Liv, how do we make sure when we build these systems that they're transparent and that resources are inclusive and equitable?
Well, it's a tricky one. I would say, first of all, there is a distinction between by design and by implementation, and that is also what we are assessing with the DPG standard is do no harm by design. And I think it's very important to say that, because you cannot control, that's the whole point, right? All the adaptations and implementations. I do think there are good ways of advocating for it as much as possible. And that's, of course, downstream transparency and openness in implementations is also something we encourage, because that also enhances the opportunity for collaboration. And I think inclusiveness in design, for instance, is I mean, the principles are designed with the intended user and understand the user needs. So I think those are more general good practices for digital, not only for DPGs, but for digital in general. But I will say that it's not harm-free or risk-free. And it is something that I do think there is also a need to understand that the accountability structures around the implementation are not necessarily ensured by the design. So I do think that is kind of a call to action also for that many different stakeholders to take that role in also advocating for transparency in implementation and best practices downstream.
I think you make a lot of good points, and who the actors are, who the stakeholders are, and who holds everyone accountable. I have just a couple more questions for you, and I know you have to leave early. Is there an example of where a digital public goods or DPG has actually contributed to solving a real world problem? Like I said before, I'm fairly new to this, to DPGs and what the approach. Can you give a concrete example of how a real world problem has been solved?
Yeah, sure. I would, it is an example I love to give because it also includes sharing. So when COVID hit, for instance, and it's relevant to this audience because it's around health, there was already this, I mentioned this platform DHIS2, right, which was already widely in use by more than 70 countries, actually. It's a large number as part of their health information system structure. But what happened when COVID came was that because there was this vibrant open source community with also local and regional hubs, Sri Lanka very rapidly, because Sri Lanka has a very tourism dependent economy, very quickly built the COVID tracker on top of the DHIS2, because they were losing out because they had to stop all inflows from tourists until they had some idea of how the disease was spreading, and they wanted to be able to keep the country as open as possible. Mm-hmm. And they therefore invented or innovated this tracker, but then they shared it back with the core, which made it into a more generic version. So it was first implemented in Sri Lanka with real benefits for Sri Lanka in terms of helping it more quickly and keeping its own country as open as possible. But then it was actually implemented in more than 35 countries very quickly. Wow. Because this tracker was shared back openly, and because it was built on top of an existing DPG and really tapping into a big existing community. So I think that to me is a very powerful example of several things, how DPGs can enable us to rapidly address urgent challenges like COVID and to at least find joint solutions for joint problems. But also, and I do think this is very important particularly for people like myself who have worked in an international development assistance provider, and this idea of like the donor recipient narrative, which is still quite strong I do think, where did this technology come from? And it came from Sri Lanka. It actually ended up being reused by local municipalities in Norway, for instance.
Wow.
So I do think this example also illustrates the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals to me.
What a great, as you said, timely example of a DPG that really hit home for, I'm sure, quite a few of us on the webinar today. Liv, I know you have to jump, but I appreciate you taking the time today to kind of frame this conversation. And you gave me a lot of good nuggets to question the other panelists about. And so I hope they're ready. You gave them quite a few challenges and call to actions, and I'm excited to ask you. So again, thank you again for joining us, and talk with you later. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, and sorry that I have to jump so early, but I'm sure it will be a great conversation. Thank you, Kormaki.
As Liv leaves the stage, I would love to welcome back Yinka, Seb, and Heba. I think Liv really set the stage for our conversations now, and would love to just have a great conversation with the four of us. So I do have some specific questions, but I will love a conversation. If something really jumps out at you, please feel free to jump into the conversation. There is no kind of rules here in the conversation. So now that we have Yinka, Seb, and Heb back to the virtual stage, we'd like to shift our conversation to applications of DPGs in the social impact space, specifically around public health, epidemiology, and financial inclusion. So to start off the conversation, Liv talked about all the stakeholders, private company, individuals, academia, and social impact organization, how they come to the space around digital public goods. How about I'll start with you, given where you're at currently. What is the importance of cross-sector collaboration in the digital public ecosystem, and particularly from the private sector approach?
Thank you so much for bringing me in, and it was really interesting listening to Liv define the terms and the objectives and the examples. It's fantastic, and the work she's doing is fantastic. So I would like to say that digital public goods are a product of collaboration, of cross-sectoral collaboration. It's an idea that is often forgotten, and if there is one thing that I would like the participants and listeners here today to leave with, is that we need to think of digital public goods as a circle of innovation that connects the different phases of human enterprise. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking of three specific phases of human enterprise. One is the civil service enterprise, the other is the charitable enterprise, and the third is the profit-making enterprise. And digital public goods would not be here without the collaboration between these three aspects. And the reason I want to start with this and leave the participants and listeners with this is that when we look at the conversation relating to digital public goods, very often it kind of hides an adversarial posturing between the public and the private, the for-profit, the not-for-profit. And that adversarial posture is what I constantly challenge when I join conversations about digital public goods and digital public infrastructure. We need to think about this not as X versus Y of the different facets of human enterprise, but rather as this virtuous cycle of connections and cross-fertilization. I want to give one example of how subtle that interconnection is. I looked at some recent research about the distribution of contributors to open source software. There was a very good paper that came out in 2022 by a group of researchers from Vienna that mapped that. And they offered two tables. One table about the share of different countries to open software according to the GitHub. And the second table is about per capita share per country. And for the first table shows that the United States remains the main contributor or the largest contributor of open source software, contributing 24%. So of the total number of contributors on the GitHub, 24% come from the United States. Of course, we have to note that the United States is made of all sorts of groups, lots of people converging of the United States from all over the world to contribute to the ecosystem there. So it's not really a story of the U.S. It's also a story of immigration. But at the end of the day, it's within the United States ecosystem is where 24% of contributors exist. When you look at the second table, which capture per capita, you find that the top 20 nations in terms of per capita contributors come from open market economies and open both economically and open politically as well in terms of democratic values, freedom of expression, rule of law, and so on. So this shows you that the clear symbiosis between openness, market dynamism, private sector innovation, and the generation of open source technology and open source software. So when we start talking about the collaboration, it is so embedded in the idea of digital public goods that it is not about arguing for it. It's about simply seeing it, recognizing it, and unpacking it to see how we can create more of it. It would be amiss if I don't mention data.org as an example of public-private charitable collaboration in the production of digital public goods. Data.org comes out of the convergence of the work of two charitable philanthropic organizations, one of which is the Center for Inclusive Growth of MasterCard. And the Center of Inclusive Growth draws on the core competencies of a large private sector corporation, MasterCard, in terms of data assets and data insights, technology, capital, you name it. So the data.org itself is a great example of what this collaboration means and what it produces. And it's focused on enabling governments and not-for-profit organizations to use data science. I think I would argue, and I'll leave you with that, education is the ultimate global public good, and digital education is the ultimate digital public good. And I think we need to remember that and go take the conversation from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Heba. I think you made some great points there. I would like to just shift the conversation to Yinka, because I also believe, and I know you talked about the private sector, but I also believe that a lot of times solutions need to be closer, need to be also developed closer to the problem, right? You need a kind of a bottoms-up approach. You need other people, other collaborators to really get a good solution. So Yinka, can you talk about what you see as the drivers for individual contributors across cross sectors, domain expertise to support DPGs?
Thank you, Kamiki. And I think you're absolutely correct in that being close to the edge of the problem is very important, because context, geography, a lot of these things matter in the social space. So how do we ensure that these individual contributors are part of the process? I think the first is giving them access and visibility in terms of what they're able to do. How do they begin to showcase their own ideas and their own thoughts? And again, present the problems that they're encountering in their different domains to the global space as well. I think that also creates opportunities for collaboration. And I think one of the things we need to be mindful of is this is an iterative process. We're starting with it. And I think the example Liv gave about the health information system and the extension of it is a good example. So you start with a base foundation and you collaboratively build on it. So visibility and access to these types of platforms opens up the door to say, how do I collaborate with other projects? That's the first step. But the second step is, what data do we have access to, and how do we sort of continue to build and evolve our models with different sets of data? And I think the third stage is what Heber also alluded to, in that how do we document and build the evidence base for these things from a research community perspective? So having access to these platforms, having these innovative communities at the grassroots is so helpful. Because it's almost like you're crowdsourcing different ideas and different solutions for different problems that in some cases some communities or some markets have moved on from those types of problems. So when you think about Africa, we're still talking about malaria, we're still talking about some of these infectious diseases that the rest of the world has forgotten about. So, but then we're looking at it from a global perspective in that the SDGs are the North Star that we're focusing on. And how do we ensure that all lives, all 8 billion lives of the planet have the opportunities? So it's really one bite at a time, one person at a time. But again, co-creating and ensuring that we create this collaborative environment to ensure that access is available and problems are being solved. Thank you.
Thank you, Yinka. Seb, I don't want to leave you out of the conversation. We've talked about collaboration, but there is an actual thing here that we're collaborating on. Can you talk about some of the biggest hurdles to creating community-based open software? And if you can apply it to, from an epidemiological perspective, what's the outside benefit of getting it right?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with the hurdles, and I think that the first one is the question of who actually does the work, and how are they incentivized to do so, or how are they incentivized? And the problem, at least in the sphere where I work in epidemiology, we have that most software development is happening in academia, but the incentives in academia are not aligned with the kind of community benefit that you get from creating and maintaining open source software. The incentives are on kind of creating novelty and kind of individual expertise and excellence, and not so much on kind of the community maintenance that you need for high quality open source software. And I'd really like to shift the focus here a bit from creation to maintenance, because I thought it was important that Liv earlier highlighted the sustainability of these public goods. And creation of open source software is really just the first step, and there's an enormous amount of work that needs to go into maintaining and supporting open source software, fixing problems, helping others apply it. And that is something that's not particularly compatible with the academic model, where funding cycles are in sort of 3 to 5 years, and then there needs to be a clear outcome of something novel that has been created. Right. And so as a consequence, then most of the open software development is done by people as a hobby on the side, or something that they sort of fit in between their other academic work. And that is very difficult to motivate. It's also very difficult to maintain. And it leads to software projects being abandoned when people move on to other projects and potentially other work. And so I think there's a real challenge in kind of creating communities of people who are engaged but also incentivized to contribute to open source development and maintenance. And there's lastly a challenge of expertise. So, and there's a question of how we best leverage a range of expertise. We're talking about creating software that is applied in the sphere of epidemiology and public health. So it's fairly kind of specific. There are specific methods that need to be encapsulated and encoded in the software. But then if we have software developers that are not epidemiologists, and epidemiologists who are not software developers, how do we best leverage that expertise without creating errors in the software, or perhaps methodological errors created by those focusing on the software development? So all of these are the challenges that we're trying to address, and which leads me to the benefits, and I'll focus on two. And the first benefit is that having worked in the sphere of analyzing data from outbreaks and trying to inform the response to infectious disease outbreaks for 10 years now, we're in the same situation over and over again every time there's an epidemic, which is that we have to perform fairly routine tasks. They're always the same. It's always things like, what is current transmission and transmissibility? What is the fatality ratio? What are the delays, the reporting delays in the system? And what does, sort of reflecting those delays, what does the data that we see tell us about the underlying system and the underlying dynamics? And even though these are always the same tasks, we really start from scratch every single time there's an outbreak, because we don't have any high quality, well-maintained, off-the-shelf tools available that would allow us to perform these. And this is really critical, because the point at which these analyses are most relevant and informative is early on, is at the very earliest stage of an outbreak. Time is really of the essence, and we lose time because we don't have robust tools available. And so I think the benefit from creating these or from creating and maintaining these, or the benefit from potentially having these available in that sense is huge in terms of the robustness and timeliness of early analysis. The second benefit is there's also an issue of equity, and the methodological expertise for performing analyses of outbreak data is largely concentrated in high-income countries and well-funded universities. And the lack of generally applicable tools means that this expertise is often inaccessible to others. And that means that analyses are either performed in high-income countries and in collaboration with people elsewhere and leading to all sorts of imbalances. But also it means that otherwise analyses are perhaps done to a lower standard elsewhere or not at all. And so I think there's a real equity aspect to creating general tools that are accessible, as well as building the capacity around that to allow kind of relevant analyses for situational awareness to be performed wherever a crisis is happening.
Thank you for those two perspectives, Aseb. Just to shift focus just a bit from the health focus to financial inclusion, Yinka, talk a little bit about why it's important to get digital public goods product right in the financial inclusive space.
Okay, great. Thanks, Komiki. And I think the first thing I'll start off with is when we talk about financial inclusion, it's really about access, usage, quality, and the impact of financial services, especially to the lower income. So when a lot of people don't understand the scourge of financial inclusion because we think that everybody has an account, but as of 2021, in the last World Bank Findex rankings, there's still about 1.4 billion people around the world that are underserved. And again, the lion's share of them are also women. So what are the impacts of digital public goods in financial services space? A lot of these people are underserved because they're also the poorer at the base of the pyramid kind of people. So affordability is critical. How do we get financial services across every nook and cranny of this planet? In other words, distance distribution of financial services is critical. Yes, the mobile phones and digital telephony were able to leapfrog and catalyze adoption using mobile money systems. But then again, does everybody have a mobile phone? Is there connectivity everywhere? The internet is not available in many places. In some locations in Africa, you have to climb up on a tree to get good service, etc. So when we talk about digital public goods for financial inclusion, we first of all look at the infrastructure. Do we have proper connectivity in terms of getting the infrastructure to everybody who could even have a mobile phone? Because you can buy devices, but if these devices can't be used, then there's no point. The second thing we would also look at is the public goods themselves. How do we ease up onboarding? And this is where government data also comes in, because identity is one of the critical elements and public goods that we need to get across. So how do we ensure that we're not duplicating, we're not replicating, we're not creating disparate systems and fragmented systems around doing processes that we can do with the same data sets and validate people on board? And by the time you put all these pieces together and then the distribution of it, financial services are expensive to deploy to more rural locations where they're needed. So public goods would help us break down the costs and ensure that we can provide better access at the bottom of the pyramid. Thank you.
Thank you, Yinka. Heba, recently Sab just talked about the maintenance is one thing to create things, but the maintenance is also a big part of that, and having people there to continuously update these products. That also give me that, we want the shiny new thing, we want the next thing, and sometimes what's expected and what's new may not be what we need at the time. What are the repercussions and unintended consequences if we don't get these products right and maintain them?
So I would start by saying that the biggest and the repercussion of not getting it right that we are all concerned about is digital exclusion and financial exclusion. That's the test. It's digital exclusion and financial exclusion. If a solution leads to more of that, then we have a problem. If a solution leads to less of that, then we have something that is working for the public interest. That's why when I discuss digital public goods or digital public infrastructure, I often emphasize that the public should be, the P should be a small p, as in public interest, not necessarily public institutions. So and the litmus test is inclusion. So when we don't get it right, we lead to more people being excluded.
Right.
How do we not get it right? I want to pick up on something that Sebastian said, is that the technology is only one piece of it, especially in the area of financial inclusion. The technology is probably one piece and a small piece of what needs to happen for the citizens and consumers to receive relevant products and services. There is a lot layered on top of that, not least of which the whole governance and incentives that lead to a rich and deep ecosystems. I was very interested and happy when I saw that you pursued the question of sustainability in talking with us and also in talking with Liv, because the question of sustainability shows up as a challenge in every piece of this of the digital public goods ecosystem. Like even identity, which is the most obvious of all the digital public goods. Maintaining national digital identity systems is hard and raises the questions of financing. So if there is one thing that constitutes a consistent challenge across this huge variety of what we call digital public goods, it's the sustainability, economic sustainability aspect of it, and the incentives that encourage different players, contributors, developers, and private sector players to contribute and participate in helping the ecosystem deliver its outcome, which is the inclusion, digital and financial inclusion, and health inclusion, and so on. Sometimes, when I join these conversations, it gets a little bit adversarial, as I have said, and people tend to say like the likes of MasterCard are just defending commercial positions, yeah. And I like to address that directly. I would even go as far as argue that raising the sustainability, the economic sustainability question, and raising the commercial viability solution to the economic sustainability question is a public good. And in the area of digital, it's a digital public good, because we will not be able to, as you said, this is new, we will not be able to shape it the right way unless we really put all the concerns on the table and debate them, each one of us wearing the hat that they're most familiar with or most comfortable with. So I want to there is a lot of space, and as our CEO tends to say when you talk about this, the inclusion is such a wicked problem that we cannot preclude any solution. All solutions and everyone who can contribute to a solution needs to work at it, whether it's public, private, charitable, everyone, academia, everyone needs to contribute to this issue. So we cannot preclude any solutions in that regard. But we also, in the same vein, we should not preclude from the conversation also commercially viable solutions as a way of reaching the outcomes that we expect from digital public goods. So Anna, I'll stop here.
Well, how about I want you to continue, because you brought up a couple of great points there. But there was a thread there that I thought you were going to go with around accountability and trust, because you brought up who's all the actors who should be involved in that. How do you make sure that we hold people accountable for inclusion, that we're developing the right systems, that things are transparent, and what can we do when trust is broken? How do we hold people accountable in this space?
This is a very important question, and it's the trust question. I have to say, it's not yet getting the level of attention that it needs in the digital public goods conversation. There is a principle, part of the standard of digital public good, that says do no harm. Yeah. At this point, this principle remains aspirational. As I'm a lawyer by training, I'd like to see, what are the nuts and bolts that will lead to do no harm. And I would argue that from a design perspective, to do no harm, we need to ask two questions. What is the harm that can happen? And really do the analysis whenever we're introducing a digital public good. What's the harm that this digital public good can do? So far, we've been very focused for a good reason, optimistic reason, and optimism is in itself a good reason, focused on the benefit of digital public good. But we need to ask the question, every time we introduce a digital public good, what's the harm that this digital public good can produce? And ask the question, who will be responsible when this harm takes place? Because liability, from a lawyer's perspective, liability structures are the best way to make sure harms are addressed and mitigated. You probably, some of you or all of you are aware that there is a very important case going on in London at the moment where developers of code in Bitcoin are being sued for liability because of a hack that led to major losses of funds. And this is a very dangerous precedent, because if or like potential precedent, is still a case in court, it's not settled yet. But if developers were to be held, like open source developers were to be held liable for consequences that they could not anticipate of hacking of the codes that they have produced, that will, if we had a problem so far of finding people to maintain these systems, we will have a huge problem going forward. And the solution to that is not to say that no one is liable, but the solution is, when we think about digital public goods and when we think about the foundation of the digital ecosystem, we need to ask the question, what harm could happen and who's going to be liable for this harm if it happens, so that we create the incentive for harm mitigation and harm management. Also, we need to increase demand for privacy, for accountability, for security amongst the last mile user. The last mile user deserves protection, deserves trusted services and goods. We cannot continue to have a kind of an either or between access and quality. It has to be access with quality, access with trust. And the issue that we're facing right now is that that demand is not vocal yet, is not there yet. So there is another digital public good that we need to build. It's the digital public good in developing the skills of the last mile user, not only to use the digital products and services, but to understand the risks of the digital products and services and know how to manage the risks of the digital products and services and what to ask for from the providers of these digital products and services, whether they're philanthropic, government, or private sector. So this is a digital public good. And I think we need to invest in it as much as we are investing in the development of product solutions, infrastructure, platforms, whatever it is that we are developing right now, rightly, to address the inclusion problem.
Thank you for that, Heba. Seb, earlier you kind of took my thunder when you were talking about maintenance and capacity building, and you need the population trained. So I think a lot of times when we think about data, we don't often think about the one real key dependency is a skilled population trained to use and apply to data sets. Last year, data.org released the Workforce Wanted Data Talent for Social Impact report and identified the opportunity to develop 3.5 million purpose-driven practitioners from developing countries over the next 10 years. The goals of DPGs and open source solutions are to unlock a more equitable world by bringing more people in to create solutions. Seb, I know Epiverse is developing tools for epidemic preparedness and response, but capacity building is also a significant pillar of this initiative. Can you talk about the interconnectedness between DPGs, or digital public goods, and purpose-driven data capacity?
Yeah, so I think you're spot on. They're inseparable, I think, and there's no use in creating a bunch of tools that either aren't useful for people or that nobody can apply. So the training needs to go hand in hand with the development. And we're trying to ensure this by having partnerships with across the globe and sort of trying to build up that capacity. But then it's not just capacity building. It's a two-way street, right? And there's kind of both informing what we perhaps do in collaboration with people, say, with what the needs and demands are and how something is useful elsewhere, as well as co-creation of tools with people, we have partnerships in the Gambia and in Latin America, and so ensuring that there's this kind of aspect of capacity building is reflected. And I think, in a perfect world, we'd be in an interconnected community of users and developers of the tools. And users, ultimately users to some degree, users are developers of the tools because they can feedback, they can highlight issues, they can report on things that are currently missing. So I think there's many layers to this aspect of capacity building, and I think it's a really crucial one, as you say.
Thank you for that. Yinka, one last question for you. Earlier, you talked about making sure that people have access to financial tools, but can you also talk about, to Seb's point, builders and contributors need to be diverse across race, gender, caste, socioeconomic ability? How do we make sure that we have a diverse population of builders and contributors to the space?
Well, I think it's all about being deliberate by design and realizing that we're not all cut out of the same cloth, and really taking that into consideration. And I'll use different parts of Africa, for example. How are we building in local languages? So when we're talking about the last mile, are we still building tools that are only accessible in English language, or are we building tools that are accessible in native languages, knowing that people speak different types of languages? So we need to ask ourselves, do we have the right teams within the ecosystems that we're working in? Do we have the right people in those teams? Are they coming from different sectoral backgrounds? Because cultural nuances are so important in a lot of these things. And one of the things, being in Nigeria and living in a city like Lagos, is that we have this mindset that Lagos is a reflection of Nigeria. But honestly speaking, Lagos does not capture Nigeria. I think it's really an anomaly within the Nigerian ecosystem. So we need to build systems and realize, first of all, accept and acknowledge that we're all at different stages of evolution on this in the digital space. The digital economies are developing at different stages. How do we have strategies around urban development and rural development? And how are we more deliberate in ensuring that we learn more about the rural nuances? Because a lot of the last mile adoption is about behavioral change. And we can't change behaviors from sitting in our city offices and expecting that, oh, we're going to create this tool without really understanding how does it work within their own context. So, and I think as Seb said, how do we work collaboratively to ensure that those feedback loops are maintained and developed? So building programs, there's a lot of programs for girls in STEM. There's a lot of programs, and these are programs across nations, across Africa, and across different markets. But how do we ensure that they're also not just learning the STEM, but they're actively placed in projects that can actually solve these problems as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Yinka. We have quite a few questions that have come in through the chat and the question and answer. So I want to make sure that we can get some of those answered. So Seb, first, you're up first. Do you think there's a risk of having too many DPGs at some point? While it's always probably be a challenge to get donors to focus their resources, if there are too many duplicative solutions, might the resource to support those projects be spread too thin?
Yes, I think that's a very fair point. And I think it really also goes back to the point I've been trying to stress, that there is huge value in supporting and maintaining existing tools there's always the temptation to create new stuff, but there's an outsized benefit, I would say, from looking what's out there already and actively avoiding duplication and instead supporting something that is perhaps already out there. I think that is a key element in there in avoiding duplication and replication.
And I think it goes back to your earlier point around maintenance and how long that takes and what have you. So I agree with your point. The next question, Yinka, was for you. What would you suggest to a new organization that seeks to create a DPG from the offset? How do we start to ensure we're on a strong path to development, fund, and support technology that helps solve real problems in a sustainable way for people in countries all around the world? Any ideas there, Yinka?
Well, Again, it's a very broad question, and I'm not sure if there's a magic bullet answer to that type of question, because countries all around the world have different problems. But I would always say start with a problem in mind. There isn't one problem, there's different problems. So how do a problem that exists in Nigeria and Colombia could have different solutions depending on how the problems manifest. So I think that we have to be very careful that this might not be as general as we want, but there might be some specific nuances that are context sensitive, language sensitive, that we also need to bear in mind. But I would always say start with a problem in mind, and we know the goal, we know the outcome that we're trying to get to, but we also it can't be this bubble in a way. Thank you.
That's right. Every country is different. As you said earlier, Lagos is very different from the rest of Nigeria. So the problems there may not be the same problems that you would face in North Carolina in the United States. So I agree with your assessment there. And Heba, you have the last question for today. How would an organization ensure there's authenticity of the shared information across an organization? And how best would shared data act upon to enhance a public good?
So I'll go back to the point, kind of a thread that cuts across what I've been saying. We need to remember that digital public goods are not just open source software; they're also data insights, AI, open algorithm, and open standards. That are really open standards, have been very crucial for achieving financial inclusion. So to ensure authenticity, the quality of data is an issue, and it's an issue that triggers a lot of the discussion that we have been having so far on the question of maintaining the data. So while the data is non-rivalrous, maintaining the data and cleaning the data is actually a very resource-intensive human endeavor. So the first step in ensuring authenticity is ensuring quality and making sure that you provide sufficient resources to maintain the data sets that are being relied upon by countries and health authorities around the world and farmers around the world, to ensure that this data quality has integrity and is well maintained and shared authentically. Another point that I would like to say, which takes me back to the education theme, I wanted to take this moment to stress that ultimately what guarantees authenticity and integrity is the group of stakeholders that challenge and check and hold providers accountable. And you cannot have that if the broader ecosystem of stakeholders is not educated and does not have the digital tools. There's one initiative that I'm very proud of that MasterCard has, which is Girls for Tech. And it's a digital public good in the sense that it's a curriculum that targets girls, specifically middle school girls, with digital education, like in cybersecurity, fraud protection, and it's geared towards preparing them for careers in STEM, especially for careers that allows us to fill the huge gap in cybersecurity skills around the world, and hopefully, to the point you were discussing earlier about having representation. Increasing the number of girls that are in those careers. I would say these elements, and there's no simple answer, are what allows us to guarantee authenticity and quality of data at the digital public good.
Thank you for Heba, and thank you for wrapping it back to, I think, the thread that Sebastian brought up, Yinka brought up. It is about the people, that we have to make sure that we have the capacity to look at the data systems, to build them, to maintain them, and all of these, we wouldn't be able to do anything around digital public goods without the capacity of individuals thinking about social impact and how digital public goods can impact those. Well, we're at time today, and we've had such a great conversation with Liv kicking us off and framing the conversation. Yinka, your grateful insights from financial inclusion and from your work in Nigeria. Heba, your perspective from the private sector, and Seb from your work in the health space. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm sure that, like myself, everyone in the audience learned a lot about digital public goods and how they can help their organization move forward. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
you.
Komiki.
Thank you.
Thank you.